let me introduce you to my revolutionary new system, which I call the 35 Tribes Theory. Rather than worry about where Canadians fall on some sort of ideological axis, I have just used my knowledge as a professional Canadian political analyst to identify 35 discrete factions that tend to come up the most in conversations about Canadian politics. Some of these are voter segments, some are factions of the political elite, some are more intellectual factions you tend to hear mostly from in the Canadian media, but collectively, they all shape what we would call Canada's political culture. Now, some members of my 35 tribes are similar to the ones that we saw on the political compass, but since I am less concerned with meeting quotas of ideologies, mine tend to have more to do with identities of class and culture and geography that aren't so easily sorted philosophically. All right, so let's just get into it. I will now go through the list and describe each one of these 35 identities to you, one at a time. And because I know that you guys liked it when I did it improv last time, I will proceed to do the rest of this video unscripted as well. All right, so the first one I have here is the social conservative. So social conservatives are usually considered one of the major factions within the Conservative Party proper. Whenever the Conservative Party is electing a new leader, as it is right now, the preferences of the social conservatives are always a big part of the analysis of the party. Social conservative is really just another name for like the Christian right or evangelical sort of faction of the party. These are people that have very religiously inspired social views, particularly as it relates to abortion and LGBT rights. When in power, the Conservative Party leadership tends to kind of clamp down on social conservatives because they're seen as a bit of a net liability because a lot of their social views are quite unpopular in modern Canada. But there are a lot of socially conservative Christians in Canada, and they tend to flex a lot of their power behind the scenes, particularly in the context of something like a leadership race to pick the next head of the Conservative Party. All right, and then on the opposite extreme, next to the social conservative, I have the Red Tory. This is another supposed faction within the Conservative Party base, although I would say it is probably a faction whose influence is fast decreasing. A Red Tory is basically a very moderate conservative. They call them Red Tories because the traditional color of the Conservative Party is blue and the traditional color of the Liberal Party is red, so you get it, they're kind of like more liberal conservatives. There is a kind of thinking now that the Red Tories had a lot of sort of political sway in like the 70s and maybe even the early 80s within the old Conservative Party, which was explicitly called the Progressive Conservative Party. But since the 1990s and the 2000s and the 2010s, the thinking is that the new Conservative Party, the Conservative Party of Canada, has become a lot more ideological, a lot more kind of dogmatically orthodox in its conservative politics, and a lot less open-minded to granting influence to the more moderate faction of the party. And so a lot of people would argue that in turn, that faction of the party has mostly wandered off, joined the Liberal Party or whatever. But this idea of like an internal conflict between like the orthodox conservative faction and the Red Tory faction is something you still hear played up a lot in the press when it comes to the internal affairs of the Conservative Party. I guess in American parlance, a Red Tory is sort of like a rhino. All right, and next to him, we have the Climate Doomer. This is basically somebody whose political philosophy, political priorities revolve almost entirely around the issue of climate change. As I think is the case in most countries, climate change has risen a lot in recent years to become one of the dominant issues of Canadian politics. But when I think of this faction in particular, I really sort of think about sort of the young people for whom climate change is really an issue that fills them with like so much existential dread for the future, like that there is no reason for our politics to be engaged with almost any other issue except for climate change, just because the consequences are so catastrophic that you cannot have a government in good conscience that can leave this issue to be even the second priority. And I think that you're starting to see in Canada a lot more like climate activism led by young people for whom this issue is just of such exceeding importance that it even is starting to take a bit of, I would say, an emotional, psychological toll on them. This is something that I think very much as being a dividing issue between my generation and like the Zoomer generation. Whenever I meet young people that are interested in politics, people younger than myself who are interested in politics, I'm often a little bit taken aback by just how seriously they take climate change and just how much of a central animating principle it is in their entire political consciousness. and their consciousness of what matters most in this life. All right, and next we have the ethnic vote. So Canada's, of course, a very diverse country, and it has become a lot more diverse in recent decades due to our extremely high intake of immigration. And this high intake of immigration, coupled with the relative ease at which you can become a citizen of Canada and thus a voter, has led to an increased focus being given to the so-called ethnic vote, which is the vote of new Canadians or ethnic and religious minorities. They're kind of one and the same in Canada because the vast majority of immigrants that come to Canada are now racial and religious minorities. There can sometimes be a somewhat kind of patronizing way in which we talk about the votes of these people in this country. There's kind of a sense that because in many cases the quote-unquote ethnic vote is comprised of people who have arrived in Canada relatively recently, that they can kind of be, manipulated with various explicit appeals to their faith and their background and maybe even the politics of the country that they left. There has been sort of a rise of a new class of Canadian politician who build their reputation on the pretense that they're very good at sort of wrangling the ethnic vote in this way. These are often white politicians that sort of imagine themselves to understand the concerns of the various different ethnic demographics that have risen to become quite prominent particularly in big cities in modern Canada. Politicians like Jason Kenney, who is the Premier of Alberta, and Patrick Brown, who is the Mayor of Brampton, Ontario. These would be two very prominent examples of white Canadian politicians who imagine themselves as being very good at sort of wrangling the ethnic vote in various ways. This entails things like going to their churches and temples and stuff, and going to their, holiday festivals and things, and really sort of pressing the flesh and glad handling and, pandering in ways like that. The political parties now also run a lot of immigrants as candidates these days, which has led to the rise of a similar sort of like political figure who is very much sort of seen as being of a particular ethnic demographic and can thus, presumably kind of wrangle their votes as one of them. Again, like this is all somewhat distasteful stuff to talk about, and I don't want to be sort of too reductive about it, but this is, I think, a kind of narrative that has become much more prominent as Canada has become a more diverse society. But powerful as the ethnic vote is, nothing can compare to the Quebec vote. Quebec is, of course, the second biggest province of Canada, the French-speaking province with a French-Canadian majority population. This isn't mathematically true, but there is a kind of conventional wisdom in Canada that the path to power, the path to becoming prime minister, runs through Quebec. So unless you have a strategy to win the Quebec vote, you're never going to be close to running the show. Some of this is the result of a kind of sort of patriotic idea of what Canada is, that the idea that Canada is kind of like primarily a union between the French Canadians and the English Canadians, and that therefore like a government with any sort of like moral credibility has to have a strategy to win the Quebec vote, otherwise they're kind of like illegitimate in some sense. But anyway, this has given a lot of attention being given to sort of what it is that the Quebecers want, what it is that the French Canadian Quebecers in particular want from their government, from their politicians. These days I feel like the conventional wisdom is that Quebecers have become a lot more sort of nationalistic, in a kind of culturally sort of chauvinistic kind of way. And so to win their votes, you kind of have to pander a bit on some of that stuff. Some of their sort of French supremacist language laws and desire to sort of limit immigration and stuff like this. These are the kind of things that you kind of have to pretend to be on side with if you want to win the Quebec vote, just because the Quebec voters are in a sort of nationalistic mood these days. The big thing is that you always have to pledge to respect Quebec's jurisdiction. The idea that even if you do wind up as prime minister in charge of the federal government, you will always respect Quebec's right to make its own decisions for itself. That's how you win the Quebec vote. Next to the Quebec vote, we have the Union Man. So Canada is not like Europe. We do not have a hugely unionized labor force. These days, most Canadian union members are workers for either the federal or provincial governments, which is to say public sector unions. And because the Canadian labor movement is now so heavily dominated by public sector unions, unions have a lot of pull in the political conversations these days. So many of the services that government provides are carried out by public sector unionized employees, whether that is at the schools or at the hospitals. So as a result, the government's